Hello, and welcome to the second part of Industrial Revolution, which is the focus on the spread of industrialization as well as new technologies associated with industrialization. So, when we look at Unit 5, this period of time from 1750 to 1900, we start by looking at the Enlightenment, which is an intellectual revolution. Then we go to the political revolutions of Haiti, the United States, France, and Latin America, which represents political revolution. And then we go to the economic revolution, which is associated with the Industrial Revolution. And this is going to get the lion's share of attention for the fifth unit of study. So when we talk about the spread of industrialization, we remember, of course, that industrialization begins in Britain and then is going to spread from Britain to other parts of the globe. So the spread into Europe, particularly Belgium, France, and Germany, is the next thing we look at. And when we talk about time frame, we're looking at about the 1830s, 1840s. And one thing we have to keep in mind is that continental Europe is filled with revolutions during the first half of the 19th century. To kind of make a long story short, from the French Revolution, which begins in 1789, to 1848, there are a series of liberal and nationalistic uprisings that engulf a lot of continental Europe. For Britain, Britain isn't directly affected by these revolutions, so they're able to proceed with industrialization at a much quicker pace. So the impact of these revolutions on the continent is to slow industrialization down. And really, industrialization in these three regions doesn't take hold until about the mid 19th century. Now, there are certainly elements of industrialization before then, but in terms of really taking hold and seeing this whole scale change in economic growth, we have to wait till about the mid 19th century. But one benefit that Belgium, France, and Germany had was they had Britain to copy off of. The inventions, the steam engine, all of those ideas are going to leak out of Britain and be incorporated into France, Belgium, and Germany much quicker than it was. And this is one of those things about technological advances. When a country does decide to modernize, when a country starts to see technology modernize, what they do is they pick up with the most advanced idea. So, for example, there are parts of the world that never really had landline telephones. When we do start seeing a telephone network take place in recent years, they jump over the telephone cables and go right to cell phones. So we're going to see that throughout history, that when a country gets new technology, they usually get access to the most recent technology. Think of it from your perspective, speaking of cell phones. You guys have never owned a analog phone, which is what I started with. You got to jump right to more recent technology like smartphones. So, I began with phones that did not have that smart technology, did not have access to the internet. It was basically just a cordless phone for me. And then we got text messages where we had to tap numbers 3 times to get to the letter we wanted. You guys haven't necessarily had that technological experience. You came in and you just went to where we were at that moment. And that's the benefit that France, Belgium, and Germany has. They have Britain to just kind of build off of. The spread of industrialization into the United States is going to look a little different. One, we have the government providing support for an industrializing world. And this, if you remember from US history, is called the American system, which was championed by a senator named Henry Clay. And 2 of the 3 things that he advocated, one of them was a national bank, but I'm going to leave that out. Tariffs was something that Henry Clay advocated because what he wanted tariffs to do was to protect American businesses from foreign competition. And the hope was that would allow industries to grow in the United States. But the other thing, and probably more importantly, was government support of the growth of infrastructure, particularly railroads and canals. By building infrastructure, the hope was to connect the country together so that the country could grow economically. And that interconnection is very important because if I'm able to acquire resources from one part of the United States, bring it to a factory in another part, and allow for goods to be produced, and then allow those goods to be sold to a variety of markets throughout the United States, I can expand and grow an economy. So the American system kind of lays down this vision that the government would not necessarily tell people how to industrialize, but would provide the support through policies for industrialization. Second, we have this civil war in the 1860s, which is going to disrupt this development of industrialization. It's going to slow it down. And in fact, in a lot of ways, you can see the Civil War as a competition between an agricultural view of the economy and an industrial view of the economy. In the South, where the plantation system was still dominant, that represented more of an agricultural approach to the economy. Whereas in the North, as factories are growing and railroads are increasing, we have much more of a manufacturing or an industrial economy. Those two are going to collide in the Civil War. And in the end, we're going to see once the Civil War is over, the way is paved for industrialization in the United States. The building of the Transcontinental Railroad, which is going to connect the Pacific to the Atlantic, which is going to connect the West to the East, is something that is supported by the government. The government is going to provide loans, the government is going to provide land, but they're going to do so to private companies who are going to do the work to build the railroad. And once the railroad is built, we start connecting the economy together in a much more systematic way. And this is going to allow industrialization to grow. But the last factor that leads to industrialization in the United States is the impact of immigrants in the 1880s. Immigrants are going to start flooding in 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, and they're going to increasingly come from places like Germany, Ireland, Poland, Italy. I always give a shout out to my one side of my family, the Armenians, Russians. They're going to be coming from Central, South, and Eastern Europe. And this wave of immigrants are going to provide the cheap labor needed for factories to take off. And the immigrants are really what drives industrialization in the United States because they represent a flood of cheap labor that can support and grow factories here in the cities that are developing. So you get all of these things, the building of railroads, the support of the government, of private interests, creating policies that are favorable to industrialists. And you have this immigrant population coming in. And these three things kind of combine to create the American Industrial Revolution. Next, we look at Japan. And Japan is one that you want to start and you really want to take your time to understand. And when we get into imperialism, we're going to spend more time talking about Japan. And the key thing is to remember the Meiji Restoration. So, the Meiji Restoration represents a transformation or a transition of Japanese economics and politics and society. And it all begins with the arrival of the United States in 1853 into Japan. Now, before 1853, Japan had very tight restrictions with interaction with the outside world. The Dutch were allowed to trade with Japan, but only under very tight restrictions. Other European powers were mostly told to stay away. When the United States shows up, there's a clear and obvious understanding that the United States has progressed technologically, where Japan has not. The Japan of 1853 looks a lot like the Japan of the 1650s, when they had started to close their doors off to a lot of the West. And it didn't take long for leaders in Japan to understand that in order for Japan to survive, they were going to have to change. And that brings me to letter B, the end of the shogun and the rise of the emperor. So if you remember, you have this Tokugawa shogunate where the power is centralized, in this warlord figure that uses military strength to keep control over local daimyos. In the 1870s, that comes to the end, and a more centralized government is going to emerge. And that's an emperor based government. This centralized government is what we mean by the Meiji Restoration. And once the government of Japan has centralized under the emperor, we no longer have daimyos. We get rid of those regional differences, and everything starts to centralize under one single authority. This emperor is going to begin to pursue a policy of industrialization. And what the emperor in the Meiji Restoration seeks to do is balance the new ideas of industrialization, the modern ideas of technology, with the old traditions of Japanese society. What Japan is trying to create is a marriage between the two of them, between the old traditions and the new modern methods of production. And they're doing it because they want to make sure that they're not dominated by the outside. To them, and this is the running theme for Japan, they don't want to succumb to outside influences. They want to control their own destiny. So this move to industrialize is motivated out of a desire for self-preservation of Japanese culture. Which brings me to number two, the interactions with the West. The Japanese government is going to send students abroad to study throughout Europe and the United States to learn about the factory system, to learn about government, to learn about education, to learn about shipbuilding, and to bring those ideas back into Japan for implementation. And then the second thing is the Japanese government is going to bring in Western advisors and Western industrialists to act as consultants to teach the Japanese how to run machinery and how to build ships and to do those variety of things that had made the West so powerful. So if you've ever watched the Tom Cruise movie, The Last Samurai, that's a wonderful example of what I'm talking about. In that story, a U.S. officer is brought into Japan to advise the modernizing Japanese military. But here's the thing. Japanese interests are always going to dominate. So the dominance of Japanese interests takes priority. In other words, is a Japanese army commanded by Japanese generals, Japanese officers who learn from the US, but otherwise they will do things their way. The Japanese businesses, the Japanese factories will be run by Japanese. Western industrialists were forbidden by Japanese law to own companies in Japan. The idea was that this would still be a Japanese society. So the end result is that Japan heavily industrializes. By the 1880s, 1890s, Japan is as industrialized as Britain, the United States, France, Belgium, Germany, and Russia. So when I talk about the industrialized nations, usually we refer to the European nations like Britain or the United States. But we need to keep in mind that in the late 19th century, early 20th century, Japan is right there with the best of them. What Japan has been able to do is maintain their traditional culture. Lastly, it's spread into Russia. So for Russia, we have a transformation from above approach. So since Russia has an absolutist government, Russia is like one of the last Western empires to still be practicing absolute monarchy. By this point, there's either a hybrid of constitutional monarchies or more democratic governments. But Russia is still holding on to the old approach of politics, absolutism under the czar. So when Russia decides to industrialize, it is transformation from above. It's the Russian czar empowering his ministers to start implementing laws and policies to make Russia transform into an industrialized nation. So Russia's focus is going to be largely on the production of steel and railroads, the most famous of which is the Trans-Siberian Railroad. So Japan and Russia have something in common. Japan and Russia both utilize the central government to create policies to industrialize the nation. But the biggest difference is that Japan is much more successful at maintaining control over the process. Russia is going to start losing control. And a lot of that has to do with foreign investments. Unlike Japan, Russia relied on foreign money to support this industrialization process. Now, Japan relied on Western knowledge, but Japan was not going to owe itself to the Western societies. So they forbade Western investments and Western businesses from coming in. Russia, on the other hand, welcomed it. And what that does is it starts getting Western interests tied into Russia. We're going to see how that plays out during World War I. So we go from the spread of industrialization to the decline of Asian share of manufacturing. And this is an important side note. One, as Europe increases in its industrialization, it's going to increase its global presence. And we call this imperialism. We're going to be talking about this a lot in the next unit and in the next semester. What we want to focus on is this empire of Britain expanded throughout South Asia and Southeast Asia, as well as Africa, creating a more global presence. And the British are going to bring a strength, particularly through their navy and then through their military, which is much more technologically advanced. And they're going to start imposing their will on these different areas of Asia. So in this case, in South and Southeast Asia, shipbuilding from people of South Asia and people of Southeast Asia is going to go into decline as the British start to clamp down on shipbuilding within that region. Textile production in both Egypt and South Asia represents competition towards British textile manufacturers. So Britain is going to institute tariffs. Britain is going to start putting in laws because they control a lot of South Asia. They'll come to control a lot of Egypt. And what they're doing is they're cracking down on textile production in those two regions. Now, they'll happily take the cotton and use the cotton in British textile production, but what they won't allow are Egyptian and South Asian textile manufacturers to grow. In fact, they're going to limit them to the point that they virtually disappear. And then lastly, the decline of iron production in South Asia is another one where the British, by virtue of their control of South Asia, just simply puts the clamps down on iron production. What we'll see is during the age of imperialism, there is a revolt called the Sepoy Revolt or the Sepoy Rebellion. And the Sepoys, who are South Asians, they're a combination of Muslims and Hindus, rebel against the British. And the bullets that they're firing are being made from the iron that is being mined in that region. So the British, in a response to national security, will just simply shut down the iron production. And it's an example of how European dominance of manufacturing was helped through their technological advantages. And we'll talk about that right now. So the change in historical patterns. One, European cheap goods are flooding Asian markets. And what they're doing is they're underselling Asian manufactured goods. So let me do a side note. When I was a kid, my brother and I had soldiers. We had toy soldiers. And we had a kind of a green tank, an American tank. It was about this big. It was made of plastic. And my brother and I played with these toys all the time. My brother held on to them, and he passed it on to his son, my nephew. One day, when my nephew was in fourth grade, I was over visiting, and he brought out those toy soldiers, and he was playing with them. And I saw a really brightly green tank. And I took the tank that my brother and I used to play with, and I took the tank that my nephew had bought with his own money from Target, and I flipped it over. And the tank that my brother and I played with said "Made in Illinois." And as you might suspect, the tank that my nephew played with said "Made in China." What has happened is that China has increased in its ability to manufacture cheap goods, like that tank. And since they can produce it more cheaply than the American factories can, the American factory goes out of business, and the less expensive Chinese good is being sold in American markets. That's easy for people to understand today, but what you have to understand is that in the 1800s, the flip is happening. It's the British goods that are underselling Chinese and Indian goods. It's the British goods that are being cheaply produced because of the factory system, because of the cheap labor involved, because of the machinery. And simply put, they start to outcompete the Asian products. So you have that, and then you have the superiority of European technology. Since Europe was the one that industrialized, they were able to develop stronger and better weapons, stronger and better ships, and they were able to impose their will through a lot of the non industrialized segments of the world. And that's imperialism. That's what we look at in the next unit. Now, of course, where's the one exception to this in Asia? Japan, by virtues of the Meiji Restoration. So that's something just to understand this decline of manufacturing, the Asian share of manufacturing. And when I say Europe, what I really mean are the industrialized nations. Britain, obviously, but you can throw in the United States and you can throw in Japan as well. Now, to the third topic, technology. And you'll see we're going to divide this up into two parts. One, in terms of technology, there's two different stages of the Industrial Revolution, two different stages of technological development. The first Industrial Revolution focuses on textiles, steam, and iron. So it's mechanizing the process by which we make textiles. The machines are made out of iron, and the machines are powered by steam. That's easy enough. The second Industrial Revolution, which in some parts of the world is still ongoing, that focuses on oil, electricity, chemicals, steel. And it's the second Industrial Revolution that we often focus on. When you learned about the Industrial Revolution in US history, you were more likely looking at this phase of the revolution than you were the first phase. So when we look at these technological developments, we can understand these technologies to be a revolution of power, particularly with the use of fossil fuels. And of course, fossil fuels include oil and coal. So when I say fossil fuels, I'm talking about coal and then oil. And being able to burn those things, which is basically what we do, generates power. And that power is used to power our machines. It's really what it comes down to. So one of these machines is going to be the steam engine powered by coal. And the steam engine is going to provide a new source of power that's going to power the machines. Nice and easy. The combustible engine is going to come along in the second revolution. And the combustible engine is going to utilize oil-based products such as gasoline and kerosene. So the combustible engine is going to be much more powerful than what the steam engine can produce. So it can move the machines faster, if you will. The machines can work, it can power more powerful machines, and it can also do the process of machine work faster. And then lastly, electricity, which of course is something we rely on heavily today. If our electric grid went out, we would be up a creek. So the idea is that electricity starts to provide a whole new power source that transforms everything when you really think about it. Being able to take that energy and send it out as a current along cables throughout a network is going to completely revolutionize all parts of our world. So those are the three major power sources that develop, and they're all based off of fossil fuels. What they do is they revolutionize the way we move about the world. You get steamships. Steamships, the wonderful advantage of steamships is one, they don't rely on wind to go anywhere. They can go much faster than a boat sailing with sails. Two, it can go into the wind, it can go with the wind, it can go across the. It doesn't matter to the steamboat. Three, it can go up and down rivers much more easily. So if you think of like the Mississippi River, the idea before the steamboat was that goods would flow to the south to New Orleans, end up in a port, and then it would be dispersed. And then goods coming into New Orleans would have a hard time making it back up the Mississippi. With steamboats just get to go up and down the river. It doesn't care that the river current is going against it. The other thing is that steamships are going to allow people to move with with much greater regularity. Up to about the 1800s, not a lot of people traveled the world. However, after the 1800s, people are going to be moving about this globe much more easily because the steamships are going to cut down the time for travel. Locomotives are going to be the land version of steamships. When I put an engine into basically a car, and I put that car onto rails, and I power it with steam, then trains can move all across the land much quicker and much easier than anything else we've had before. And it's going to have such an impact on the speed by which we can travel over land. We start cutting through mountains, we make tunnels, we start to cross over chasms with bridges, and the trains begin to interconnect with much larger ranges of land. The first locomotive, called the Rocket, could travel a stunning 35 miles per hour. And if you kind of chuckled at that, think about the fact that we have not done that. Other than horses, we don't have anything that really transports us at 35 miles per hour. And unlike horses, the train just needs coal to keep going. The train doesn't tire out because of physical limitations. But we can also see a revolution in communication. The development of the telegraph, for example. Telegraph is basically a cable that connects 2 points, has a flow of electricity. And if I interrupt that electric current, I can communicate a message. And I do that through what we know as Morse code. So if you've ever heard of the expression SOS, which is the universal sign for help, SOS can be tapped out in Morse code with 3 dashes, or 3 dots, I apologize, 3 dots, quick little interruptions to the electric current, 3 long interruptions to the current, and then 3 short interruptions. It's the easiest code that we can make out of Morse code. SOS. 3 dots, 3 dashes, 3 dots. And those dots and dashes represent an interruption of that electric current. The telephone is going to come along later. And what the telephone allows for is for vocal communication to be transmitted over wire. Sorry, I'm running out of. I need to keep some type of liquid going in there to keep talking. And then radio, the idea that we figure out how to transmit signals from one antenna to the other to communicate over long distances. I mean, these are revolutions all being built out of the Industrial Revolution, a revolution in transportation, in power, in communication. So let's talk about the ramifications. And I don't think it's very hard to figure this out. One, you have an increase in global trade. The industrialized nations, Europe, Japan, and the United States, are going to dominate this. It's their goods that are spreading out throughout the globe. So it's Western goods going into non-European markets, going into Africa, going into Asia. Those are the goods flooding the markets. Why? Because they're cheap, and because Western governments in particular are setting up policies that favor their businesses and their industries. Third, raw materials are going to flow much more easily into the industrialized world. So as imperialism takes off, and we have a stronger European presence in, say, Africa, and mining operations are going to start extracting resources out of the African soil, those resources can be transported to European factories very easy because of all these new these new transportation methods. But the other thing that these new transportation methods do and these new technologies is they begin to develop a stronger national connection. For example, the Trans-Siberian Railroad is going to connect the massive Russian Empire in a way that has never been connected before. The United States is going to be more interconnected by virtue of that transcontinental railroad. So, India or South Asia, as railroad tracks are laid down, that's going to help to bring together this diverse region into the sense of one place, which we will come to know as India. Japan, which is centralizing and nationalizing the building of railroad tracks, is going to help to interconnect what used to be a more regional feudalistic area. So all these new technologies, they do help to increase national connection. And it's going to be associated with modern nationalism. Second, we have an increase in global migration. Europeans are going to leave Europe. Think about the Polish peasant. If the Polish peasant can now get on a train and can now make it to the coast and get on a steamship and make their way to the United States. That's quite the development. And they can do it in less time than anybody ever could in history. So you start seeing this European migration, not just to the United States, but throughout the globe. And we also see non-Europeans moving. We see Chinese moving into parts of Western United States. We see the Japanese moving into Hawaii, as well as into Australia. You see Indians, South Asians, going into South Africa, going over to Latin America. We're going to talk more about that global migration in the next unit. But the general idea is that this is all made possible by steamships and locomotives. And then lastly, these new technologies, particularly the communication, is going to create mass culture. So, just to make sure you understand mass culture, let's take Disney. Disney is marketed throughout China, throughout the United States, throughout Europe, and it's made possible, this idea of a global culture. Disney is a global culture. If you talk about the movie Coco, you can talk to people the Avengers are known throughout the world by virtue of these technologies. So the connection between leaders and followers is also going to increase. Leaders can directly communicate to their followers through radio. You're going to have much more of a direct connection. There's a reason why Hitler and Mussolini came about at the same time radio was growing. It's because here's a new method of communication, and they were able to utilize it as a way of rallying support from their followers. News and information are going to flow much easier by virtue of these new technologies. We can find out global events much quicker. Now, today, we put them to shame, but you have to understand that in the late 1800s, early 1900s, this was revolutionary, this flow of information and news. Sharing of common culture, the idea that the whole world can now share in a common event. Now, that's going to really take place through radio more than anything else. But there's a reason why the Olympics rose in 1896. The Olympics is an example of mass culture, and it's only made possible by these new innovations. And then lastly, I come back to strengthening of nationalism. When I can create a national culture through these technologies, then I can start creating a stronger sense of national identity. And that kind of concludes this part of the lecture. So the idea is that these new technologies and the spread of industrialization is transforming the globe. It's creating an inequality between the industrialized nations and the non-industrialized nations. We'll talk more about that in imperialism. And it's also revolutionizing the way people communicate, the way people trade, and the way people travel. And if you've got those basic ideas, then you'll be in great shape with this unit. And I will see you for the next lecture in the future. So, as always, bring all your questions to classes, and we'll see you next time. Bye.